In 1943, Errol Flynn was acquitted of raping two underage girls, and Hollywood was utterly besotted with him anyway. His friends coined a phrase to celebrate: in like Flynn, smooth, irresistible, unstoppable. The whole world picked it up, and by the time most people were repeating it, they had completely forgotten what it originally meant, which is exactly what Hollywood intended. He was the most desirable man alive, and Warner Bros. Had spent a decade making sure the world believed it. And nothing, not even two 17-year-old girls standing in a courtroom describing in excruciating detail what he had done to them, was going to be allowed to change that. His last girlfriend was 15 years old when they met. He was 48. She was 17 and utterly alone when he died. That phrase is still in use today, and almost nobody who says it has any idea where it came from. Errol Flynn arrived in Hollywood in 1935 from Australia with almost nothing to his name: a vague acting background, an almost offensively handsome face, and an accent that made every woman in earshot momentarily forget what she had been doing. Warner Bros. Signed him almost immediately, and within a year he was starring in Captain Blood, which became one of the biggest films of the decade and turned him into a phenomenon virtually overnight. He was 26 years old, and the whole of America had just collectively decided he was the most thrilling man alive. What followed was a run of films so commercially dominant that it is genuinely difficult to convey from this distance how famous Errol Flynn was at his peak. The Adventures of Robin Hood, The Sea Hawk, They Died with Their Boots On, each one bigger than the last, each one cementing an image of Flynn as someone who was not merely acting, but actually living a life the rest of the world could only dream about. He owned a yacht called the Sirocco. He threw parties that lasted for days. He drank prodigiously and made absolutely no apologies for any of it. And the press reported all of it with a kind of gleeful admiration that made his excesses look like further evidence of his extraordinary vitality, rather than the glaring warning signs they actually were. Warner Bros. Knew exactly what they had in Errol Flynn, and they protected it ferociously. What they could not protect him from, eventually, was himself. Errol Flynn's relationship with women was something Hollywood had been quietly managing since the moment he arrived. He was relentlessly, almost compulsively unfaithful to every woman he was ever involved with, and he pursued women with an aggression that the people around him consistently chose to describe as charm. His first wife, actress Lily Damita, married him in 1935 and spent the following 6 years in a state of badly concealed fury as her husband conducted affairs so openly and so frequently that the press reported them almost as a matter of routine. She divorced him in 1942 and described the marriage later as one of the most degrading experiences of her life. Flynn told a reporter the same week that he was relieved to be free. The stories that circulated privately about Flynn within the industry went considerably further than mere infidelity. There were whispered accounts of encounters that women had staunchly not consented to, of a man who treated the enormous power his fame gave him as something he was simply entitled to use however he saw fit, with whoever happened to be nearby, regardless of what they wanted. In the closed world of Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s, these stories stayed exactly where the studios needed them to stay, which was out of the newspapers and away from the audiences who were utterly devoted to him. Then, two young women decided they were not going to stay quiet. In 1942, two young women came forward separately with accusations against Errol Flynn that Warner Bros. Could not bury. Peggy Satterlee was 17 years old. Betty Hansen was also 17. Both accused Flynn of statutory rape. Both described encounters on his yacht and at a party where Flynn had treated their age and their reluctance as utterly irrelevant obstacles, things to be dismissed rather than reasons to stop. The cases went to trial in early 1943, and the whole of America watched with a morbid fascination. What followed was one of the most outrageously lopsided legal proceedings in Hollywood history. Flynn's defense attorney, Jerry Giesler, was one of the most ruthlessly effective lawyers in the country, and he dismantled both young women on the stand with a ferocity that left the courtroom visibly shaken. Peggy Satterlee's past was dragged throughout the proceedings in meticulous and humiliating detail. Her credibility was symmetrically destroyed over days of cross-examination, while Flynn sat at a defense table, looking relaxed and faintly amused. Betty Hansen fared no better. The jury, which included several women who were reportedly starstruck by Flynn's presence in the courtroom, acquitted him on every single charge after deliberating for just over 5 hours. Outside the courthouse, fans were waiting to congratulate him. Flynn waved and smiled and looked, by all accounts, utterly unsurprised. His friends were already coining the phrase, "end like Flynn." His publicists made sure it spread. Within months, it was everywhere, a celebration of his irresistibility embedded so deeply into the American vernacular that it outlasted everything else about him. Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen were 17 years old, and nobody coined anything in their honor. Nobody threw them a party. The rumor mill, rather than examining what had happened to them, viciously turned its attention to their pasts instead. The acquittal saved Errol Flynn's career in the short term, but it could not save him from what he was so relentlessly doing to himself. He had been drinking heavily since his 20s, and by the mid-1940s, it was beginning to show in ways the cameras could not entirely conceal. His face was thickening. His timing was slipping. The performances that had once seemed effortlessly electric were starting to require considerably more effort and delivering considerably less electricity. And the audiences who had once packed cinemas purely to watch Errol Flynn exist on screen were beginning to notice the difference, even if they could not quite name it. Warner Bros., which had spent a decade fiercely protecting and promoting him, began quietly distancing itself. The films got worse. The roles got smaller. Flynn responded to all of it by drinking more, by spending money he simply did not have, by maintaining the performance of a man who was thriving through sheer stubbornness long after the reality had stopped supporting it. He had earned an extraordinary amount of money during his peak years and spent essentially all of it on the yacht, on properties, on parties, on a lifestyle that had made perfect sense when the checks kept coming and made considerably less sense when they stopped. By the early 1950s, Errol Flynn, who had been the most desirable man in Hollywood just 10 years earlier, was struggling to get films made at all. The studios that had once fought over him were no longer returning his calls with any urgency. He was 40 years old and looked considerably older. And Hollywood, which has never been remotely sentimental about these things, had simply moved on. And then they met Beverly Adland. Beverly Adland was 15 years old in 1957 when she met Errol Flynn at a Hollywood party. She was a dancer, pretty and young, and completely dazzled by the attention of a man who had once been the most famous face in the world. Flynn was 48 and visibly deteriorating, bloated by decades of drinking, his famous looks buried under the wreckage of how he had so relentlessly treated his own body. He began pursuing Beverly immediately, and her mother, Florence, who was present throughout most of what followed, did not stop him, did not even try. Beverly later said she was a virgin when she met Flynn, and that their first encounter was not something she had consented to. She was 15 years old. Her mother knew and said nothing. What is almost incomprehensible looking back at it is how brazenly the whole thing was conducted. Flynn brought Beverly to film sets. He took her to public events. He introduced her to people as though there was nothing remotely remarkable about any of it. She appeared alongside him in his final film, Cuban Rebel Girls, released in 1959, and by most accounts, one of the most unwatchable films ever committed to celluloid. Nobody in Hollywood found any of it sufficiently alarming to intervene, which tells you something deeply uncomfortable about what that industry had decided Errol Flynn was still entitled to. Even in decline, even at 48, even with a 15-year-old girl on his arm at every public appearance. Errol Flynn died in October 1959 in Vancouver, Canada. He was 50 years old. The official cause was a heart attack, though his doctor noted his body had been so relentlessly ravaged by decades of drinking that it resembled that of a man at least 20 years older. Beverly Adlin was with him when he died. She was 17 years old, and she had nowhere to go and no idea what was supposed to happen next. The tributes were enormous. The obituaries remembered the chandeliers and the pirates in the incomparable grin and the sheer magnificent presence of a man in his prime. They remembered Captain Blood and Robin Hood, and the years when Errol Flynn had made going to the cinema feel like the most thrilling thing a person could possibly do with an afternoon. Very few of them mentioned Peggy Satterlee. Almost none mentioned Betty Hansen. Beverly Adlin was 17 and utterly bereft, and the press, which had treated her presence in Flynn's life as a colorful footnote while he was alive, largely lost interest in her the moment he was gone. Like Flynn. People still say it. They say it without knowing about the two 17-year-old girls who stood in a courtroom in 1943 and were viciously dismantled for doing so, without knowing about Beverly, without knowing that the phrase they are so casually using was coined specifically to celebrate a man walking free from a rape trial. The phrase outlasted the man, and the man outlasted the consequences. And that is the story of Errol Flynn that the phrase was always designed to make you forget. If you want more stories about what Hollywood buried to protect the people it had decided were too valuable to hold accountable, subscribe. Because Errol Flynn was very far from the only one.